By the time the ballroom went silent, Amara Reeves had already decided she was leaving. She didn't see him at first. Nobody did. They felt him, the way a room goes still before a storm, the way the air drops 2 degrees for no reason anyone can name. Then the doors at the far end opened, and a man in a black suit crossed 300 people like they were furniture, walked past the surgeons and the executives, and the women who had spent 4 years pretending she didn't exist, and stopped in front of the one person in that room nobody had come to see. He set his hand at her waist, gently, the way a hand rests somewhere it has rested before. And in a voice meant only for her, though the silence was wide enough that everyone heard it anyway, he said, "Baby, there you are." 300 people forgot how to breathe at the same time. Near the windows, a champagne flute slipped from a manicured hand and caught the table edge without quite shattering, and Amara Reeves, who less than an hour earlier had been crying quietly in a bathroom stall, looked up at a man she was almost certain she had never met in her life, and felt the entire careful architecture of the evening come apart in her hands. Welcome to Afro Soul Tales. If you're new here, kindly like, subscribe, and comment. Now stay with us through this incredible story. But to understand why a man like that crossed an ocean for a woman like her, you have to go back. Not far. 3 days. To a closet in a quiet apartment on the west side of Houston, where Amara stood in front of a deep burgundy dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion, and listened to a small voice deep in her chest that said, very clearly, "Don't go." She had heard that voice before. She had learned over the years that it was usually right. But she was 32 now, and 10 years was supposed to be long enough. Long enough for wounds to close. Long enough for cruel girls to grow into kind women. She told herself this while she zipped the dress, while she did her hair, while she drove downtown with her hands too tight on the wheel. She was wrong about all of it, and she had no idea that 8,000 miles away, a man she could barely remember was already standing at a window with his coat on, telling his security team to ready the plane. The reunion was in the grand ballroom of a hotel so new the brass still smelled of polish, chandeliers throwing warm gold across a room full of people performing the happiest versions of their lives. Amara stood near the drinks table, alone, holding a glass she wasn't drinking. From the outside, she looked like a woman who belonged anywhere she chose to stand. Composed, luminous, expensive in the quiet way that only comes from taste rather than money. From the inside, she was counting the minutes. She had already texted her best friend Renee twice. The last one said simply, "Coming here was a mistake. Call me in 45 and fake an emergency." Renee had answered in seconds. "I'll call, but give it an hour first." "You deserve to be seen, Amara. You always did." Amara had smiled at that, because Renee always knew the right thing to say. But here, surrounded by the people who had known her during the most vulnerable 4 years of her life, being seen felt less like a gift and more like a threat. She felt them before she saw them. That particular shift in the air when someone approaches with intention. She looked up, and there they were, all 3 moving toward her in the unhurried, synchronized way of women who had never had to rush for anything. Brooke Ashford in front, blonde and polished and glowing with the specific confidence of a person who had decided long ago that being important was the same thing as being good. Behind her, Sienna and Margot, the 2 satellites who had spent 4 years laughing at whatever Brooke laughed at. Amara. Brooke opened her arms like they were old friends. The hug was brief and weightless, a performance of warmth rather than the thing itself. "I genuinely cannot believe you came. Look at you. You look... wow. Good to see you, Brooke." Amara's voice came out steady, which was its own small victory. "You haven't changed at all," Sienna said, and Amara wasn't sure that was a compliment, but she took it. The questions began almost immediately, soft at first, the way a blade enters slowly before you feel the cut. So what are you doing now? Architecture, Amara said. I run my own studio. Oh, that's so lovely. The warmth wrapped around the words like expensive paper around an empty box. Still in Houston? 4 years now. Wonderful. A pause. And, are you married? And there it was. The question landed with a smile attached, which somehow always made it worse, because the smile gave Brooke deniability. If Amara flinched, she would be the one who'd made it awkward. Not yet, Amara said and reached for her glass. Oh. Brooke's eyebrows lifted, just enough. Kids? No. A longer pause this time, the kind of pause that is itself a comment. Margot, who had always been the most perceptive of the three, and was therefore the most dangerous, tilted her glass and said nothing. It was Sienna who filled the silence, tilting her head into a shape that performed sympathy, without containing any. So, you're just focusing on the career thing. I enjoy my work, Amara said. Of course. It's just, at our age, most people have kind of figured the personal side out, you know? Amara said nothing, because she understood exactly what was happening. She had survived this particular brand of cruelty before. It never announced itself. It worked through implication and suggestion, through the careful arrangement of innocent words into something that drew blood and left no mark. And then Brooke delivered the line she had clearly been saving, glancing around the room as if she were sharing something generous. You know, I always thought you intimidated men a little, back in school. You had this energy, like you didn't really need anyone. Men want to feel needed, and you always seemed so self-sufficient. She smiled. It's not a criticism. It's just an observation. Heat rose behind Amara's eyes. She blinked it back. What none of them knew, what Brooke would have died before admitting in that room, was that the loneliness they were describing had been built deliberately, by them, a decade ago. It was Brooke who had quietly told the dorm which parties Amara wasn't welcome at. Brooke who had arranged the group project so Amara did the work, and the others took the credit. Brooke, who, in 100 small, invisible ways, had spent 4 years teaching a brilliant scholarship girl that she didn't belong, and was now standing in a designer dress diagnosing the wound she had personally inflicted, calling it character. Maybe, Amara said lightly. It was a remarkable thing, that word, because on the outside she sounded almost amused. On the inside she was 18 again, bright-eyed and hopeful, learning the same lesson for the first time. And then it got worse, because the universe had apparently decided that a Wednesday evening in Houston was the appropriate moment to deliver every old humiliation at once. She felt the attention near the entrance shift, heard the warm, slightly too loud voice of a man who had learned to perform charm at every occasion. Trevor Kane. He walked in wearing a charcoal blazer and the easy confidence of someone who had never once doubted his welcome anywhere, and on his arm was a woman, tall and fair, with auburn hair and a smile that had clearly never met an obstacle it couldn't dissolve. Trevor's eyes found Amara almost instantly, because people's eyes always find the person they're trying not to look for. Amara. He said her name like a surprise he wasn't sure how to categorize. Wow. Hey. Hey, Trevor. This is Reese. He gestured to the woman, who extended her hand with the gracious confidence of someone who had never felt threatened by anyone. My fiancé. Congratulations, Amara said, and shook it. Reese's eyes did a quick, almost imperceptible sweep, the kind women perform in under 2 seconds and never acknowledge. Then she smiled, perfectly warm. Oh, you two know each other from school? Did you date? The question was innocent. The cruelest ones usually are. Briefly, Trevor said, with the specific casualness of a man minimizing something that had been neither brief nor casual. He had walked her to class for an entire semester once, until the morning he had stopped, and explained gently and terribly that it was making things complicated with his friends. With Brooke's friends. He had chosen the room over the girl, and the choice had been so easy for him that he had clearly forgotten he'd ever made it. Small world. It really is, Reese said pleasantly, and turned back to Trevor as naturally as a flower turning toward the sun. And just like that, Amara ceased to exist in that particular orbit. She stood there for exactly 4 more seconds. Then she set her glass down on the table, smiled at no one, and walked toward the restroom with the slow, deliberate dignity of a woman determined not to let any of them see a single thing. She made it inside before the first tear fell. The bathroom was mercifully empty. She gripped the cool marble of the sink with both hands and looked at herself in the mirror, and the cruelest detail of all was that her makeup was still perfect. She looked completely fine on the outside while something old and ragged tore quietly inside her chest. Why had she come? What had she been trying to prove? And to whom? The memories arrived the way they always did, in shards. Brooke describing her to someone in a hallway as that scholarship girl who tries too hard. The parties she was never once invited to, not in 4 years, while her unremarkable roommate got invitations every weekend. Trevor's hand letting go of hers in a corridor. She had survived all of it. She had built a studio from nothing, a life she was genuinely proud of when she wasn't standing in this specific room. But survival, she understood now, gripping the marble harder, was not the same thing as healing. Her phone buzzed. Renee, right on schedule, the fake emergency, the rescue she had asked for. Her thumb hovered over the green circle. Here was the door out, the one she'd arranged herself. Here was permission to leave, to drive home to her good apartment, and her good life, and never set foot in another reunion as long as she lived. She almost took it. She would think about that later. How close she came. Instead, she pressed decline, sent a single text. I'm okay. I'm leaving on my own. Pressed a tissue carefully beneath each eye, took one long breath, and pushed the door open. And the room had changed. She felt it the instant she stepped out. That shift in atmospheric pressure that happens when something powerful enters a space. The volume had dropped. Heads were turning toward the entrance. A hotel staff member near the front was speaking rapidly into an earpiece, his posture suddenly rigid with the anxiety of a man who had not been prepared for whatever was happening. Conversations had thinned into whispers, and the whispers were moving through the crowd like a current gathering speed. Who is that? Someone near her murmured. Some Korean businessman, a man in a navy suit answered, craning his neck. I heard he owns the hotel. Owns a few of them, actually. His group just closed on something downtown. The whole medical tower development. Billions. The word moved through the room and changed it. And Amara watched, even from a distance, as something extraordinary happened to Brooke Ashford. The slight lift of the chin. The hand that rose toward her hair and stopped itself, because touching your hair is too obvious and Brooke was never obvious. The fast, comprehensive recalibration of a woman who has spotted someone worth impressing. Because Brooke had a secret of her own that night, one she would not have shared for anything in the world. Her husband Grant, the cardiac surgeon, the credential she deployed like a weapon, had spent 18 months and most of their savings buying into that exact development, the medical tower downtown, and it was dying. It needed an anchor investor. It needed a Korean fund that had so far refused every meeting Grant's people had requested. Brooke didn't yet know the name of the man who had just walked in. She only knew he was rich enough to matter, and so she began, instinctively, to move. The doors opened fully, and Seo Do-jin walked in. There is a quality certain people have, a gravity, something that has nothing to do with height or beauty, though he had both. It is the way a room reorganizes itself around a person without being asked. Do-jin had it in a way that was almost unsettling, because it was entirely effortless. He was not performing anything. He was simply walking, and the room was simply responding, and he seemed indifferent to both. His suit was black and clearly not bought anywhere with a storefront, cut in the way that only bespoke tailoring achieves, a suit that whispered rather than announced. Two quiet men followed at a measured distance, careful the way trained professionals always are. He looked like someone who had never once in his life stood at a drinks table checking his phone to look less alone. The hotel's general manager materialized and began moving toward him, smiling the institutional smile of hospitality, hand extended. Dojin shook it, said something brief, and then, this was the moment the room would talk about for the rest of the evening, he simply stopped listening. His eyes had found something across the ballroom. The general manager kept talking. Dojin did not hear a word of it, he was already moving. The crowd parted the way crowds do for people who move with genuine purpose. He walked past the general manager mid-sentence. He walked past a cluster of women who had arranged themselves in his path, with the strategic patience of people accustomed to being noticed. He walked past Trevor and Reese, who looked up with identical expressions of polite confusion. He walked past Brooke, who had positioned herself near the center of the room, because the center is where important things happen, and who now watched with an expression cycling rapidly between delight and bewilderment as she registered that he was not walking toward the center at all. He was walking toward the edge, toward the drinks table, toward Amara. She glanced over her shoulder because surely there was someone behind her, someone more obvious, someone who made more sense. There was only a wall and an arrangement of white flowers in a tall vase. She turned back. He had stopped in front of her, close enough now that she could see his eyes were not as sealed as they'd seemed from across the room. There was a warmth in them that contradicted the severity of the rest of his face, like a fire glimpsed through a narrow window in an otherwise dark building. He looked at her the way someone looks at a thing they have been searching for and are quietly verifying is real. And then, softly, his hand finding her waist, he said the words that stopped the room. "Baby, there you are." Amara's lips parted. The sound that came out was barely a word. "What?" "You stopped replying to me," he said, gently, with the patience of a man who had spent a long time getting to this exact moment, and was in no hurry now that he'd arrived. Behind him, somewhere near the windows, Brooke set her champagne flute down on a table with slightly more force than the situation required. Amara's heart was slamming. She kept her voice low because 300 people were watching and she would be damned before she let them watch her come apart twice in one night. "I think," she said carefully, "you have the wrong person." The faintest suggestion of something moved across his face, not quite a smile, living at the very edge of his composure. "Amara Reeves," he said, "architect. You studied at Rice on a full scholarship, top of your program. You have a small studio here in Houston, on the second floor of a converted warehouse. You were in Seoul 11 months ago, in October, for a design conference. It rained for 3 days." He paused. "I don't have the wrong person." The detail about Seoul turned in her mind slowly, like a key in a lock she hadn't known was there. Seoul. October. Gray and cold, the kind of cold that's more damp than sharp. She had stayed 3 days longer than planned because she'd fallen in love with the city the way you sometimes fall in love with a place, as if the geography itself is telling you something. She stared at him. There was nothing familiar in the name, nothing in the suit. And yet, in the eyes maybe, in the particular stillness of him, the way he stood like a person who had learned to be very quiet inside himself. Not from peace, from surviving, something that required it. "I'm sorry. Hi." Brooke arrived with the practiced smoothness of a woman who had been interrupting conversations her whole life and never once acknowledged it. Sienna and Margot drifting in behind her. Her smile was radiant, reloaded, running now on something hungrier than cruelty. She extended her hand toward Dojin. "Brooke Ashford. I don't think we've been introduced. My husband and I actually have significant interest in Korean investment. We're involved in the medical tower project downtown, and I'd love to—" "Did you eat?" Dojin said. He wasn't looking at Brooke. He was looking at Amara, and the question had no subtext at all. It simply wanted to know the answer. Brooke's extended hand hung in the air for a long, terrible second, and then she lowered it. "No," Amara said. No." He gestured lightly toward a smaller, quieter seating area away from the crowd. Not a command. An invitation, the kind offered by a man confident of the answer who would nonetheless accept a different one. And Amara, aware of the weight of every pair of eyes in the room, aware most of all of Brooke's face, the precise moment a woman who has spent her whole life being the most important person in every room realizes she is not the most important person in this one. Went. They sat. A staff member appeared instantly with water, then vanished. Dojin turned toward her with the unhurried attention of a man with nowhere else to be. "Ask me," he said. "Ask you what?" "Whatever question is in your eyes." She looked at him. "How do you know any of that?" "My school. My studio. Seoul." Her voice dropped. "I have never seen you before in my life, have I?" "You have," he said simply, without defense, "because some facts require none. For 40 minutes, on the 2nd of October, in the rain. I looked for you for a long time after that." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasive. She was already learning the difference between his silences, and this one was the silence of a man choosing the most accurate words rather than the easiest ones. "Because you were kind to me," he said finally. "When you had no reason to be. When you didn't know who I was. When it cost you something. Your time. Your umbrella." The corner of his mouth moved. "Your very expensive coffee, which you gave away, and then never got to drink." Amara went completely still. The rain. A man on the steps of a shuttered shop, elbows on his knees, staring at the wet pavement like it owed him an explanation. She had almost walked past. She almost always almost walked past, because the city was full of people who needed things she couldn't give. But something about the specific quality of his stillness had stopped her. The stillness of a person who knew exactly where he was and had simply run out of reasons to move. He'd been coughing, so she'd ducked into a convenience store and bought him a hot ginger tea and a packet of lozenges. She'd shared her umbrella in the doorway while they waited out the worst of it. She'd given him the matcha latte she had been looking forward to for 3 blocks, because he looked like someone who needed warmth more than she did. They had talked for 40 minutes about nothing important. The color of the buildings, where the city kept its best street food, what it felt like to be somewhere far from home. And then the rain had eased, and she had said goodbye, and walked away, and never asked his name. "That was you," she whispered. "That was me." The ballroom felt suddenly very far away, like someone had turned the volume of the whole evening down to a low murmur, leaving only this small, quiet space where 2 people sat across from each other inside a moment they both understood, without saying so, was enormous. She laid the memory of the man on the steps over the man in front of her now. The damp gray jacket under the bespoke black suit, the person who'd stared at the pavement under the man the entire room had stopped for. It was him. She could see it now. The eyes most of all. She had noticed his eyes that day because they carried something very heavy and were carrying it alone, and that weight had not gone anywhere. It had simply been joined by other things. "You were sick," she said slowly. "You kept saying it was nothing." "It wasn't nothing." He looked at his hands. "I wasn't accustomed to taking help from people. In my experience, help always came with a cost. Something attached. Something expected in return." He met her eyes. "You didn't want anything. You sat in the rain with me and talked about buildings and gave me your coffee, and when it stopped you just left. Like it was nothing. Like kindness was simply something a person did." He paused. "I had come from a meeting that afternoon. There had been a betrayal. Someone I trusted completely. Family. I walked out of that building and I just kept walking for hours, with no real understanding of how I'd ended up on those steps. I was not in a good place that day." Amara thought of the way he'd looked. Not lost the way confused people are lost. Lost the way a person is lost when they know exactly where they are and have run out of reasons to care. I'm glad I stopped, she said. So am I. Something moved across his face. When I got back to my car, my security team was predictably unhappy with me, and I realized I had never asked your name. He almost smiled. But I had your coffee cup. Your name was on the order. My people searched from there. You found me from a cup. I found you, he said, because for 40 minutes a stranger treated me like an ordinary man having an ordinary terrible day. I had spent my entire adult life surrounded by people who wanted my money, my connections, my approval. And I had forgotten what it felt like to be a person instead of a resource. I was not willing to let that go without at least finding the woman who reminded me. The noise of the room was slowly returning at the edges, music lifting, conversation restarting, an event redistributing its attention now that the extraordinary thing seemed to have settled into something quieter. Amara was aware of all of it the way you're aware of weather outside a window. Present. Acknowledged. Not the thing she was looking at. Why didn't you just call? She asked. If your people found me, you had my number. I did call, he said. 3 times. Her eyes widened. She thought of the string of international numbers she'd declined over the past several months. Unknown codes. The spam she'd grown ruthless about ignoring. I thought you were... She shook her head slowly. I didn't know. I'm sorry. I know. There was no accusation in it. So I decided to come instead. You flew to Houston because I didn't answer your calls. I had business here as well, he said. Then, after a beat, with a flicker of something almost shy. Mostly I came because you didn't answer my calls. She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh. It arrived without permission, genuine and unguarded, the first real one of the entire night. And he watched it happen with an expression that was no longer almost a smile. It was a smile, small and controlled and completely real, and it changed his whole face, softened every severe line of it, turned him briefly back into the man on the steps who had looked up when she sat down beside him, startled that anyone had. She was still smiling when she felt the presence return. She looked up. Brooke. She had brought Sienna and Margot, and the 3 of them wore the carefully assembled expressions of women projecting casualness while operating with very specific intent. Brooke's smile was broader than it had been all evening, fueled now entirely by desperation rather than cruelty, because in the last 10 minutes Brooke had managed to learn the man's name. Seodo Jin, chairman of the very group whose investment her husband had been chasing across 2 continents for 18 months, and the knowledge had rearranged her entire face. I'm so sorry to interrupt. Every molecule of her attention was on Dojin now. I didn't introduce myself properly. Brooke Ashford. My husband Grant is one of the top cardiac surgeons in the state, and we're deeply involved in the medical tower development downtown, which I understand your group has been looking at. We would love, absolutely love, to have you for dinner while you're in Houston. We have a beautiful home in... Brooke. His voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. It had the quality of a door closing. Not slammed, simply shut, with quiet and absolute finality. She stopped. I heard what you said to her earlier tonight, Dojin said. He glanced at Amara, then back. His expression was perfectly composed, which somehow made it more uncomfortable to receive than anger would have been. About why she's alone. About men not wanting women like her. About how she's too self-sufficient. The color in Brooke's face shifted. Sienna went very still. Margot looked at the floor. I traveled from Seoul to find this woman, he continued, with the unhurried patience of someone who had decided exactly what needed to be said and intended to say all of it. I had people looking for her for 4 months. I called her 3 times before I came here myself. He let it sit. So I want you to understand clearly that you were wrong about everything you said tonight. Every word. And about the development. I have read the proposal your husband's group submitted to my office. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to become unbearable. I declined it this morning, before I knew any of you would be here. That decision had nothing to do with this room. But I'll tell you honestly, nothing I have seen tonight has made me regret it. The silence was exquisite. Brooke opened her mouth. Then she closed it. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, she had nothing to reach for. No charm offensive, no graceful pivot, no reframe. She simply stood there, in her beautiful dress, in her beautiful life, with her cardiac surgeon somewhere behind her and a dying investment in front of her. And she had nothing. Because there is no response to being quietly, completely, publicly dismantled by a man who does not even raise his voice to do it. She left. Sienna followed immediately. But Margot paused. For just a fraction of a second she looked at Amara, and something crossed her face that had been buried under a decade of going along with whatever Brooke decided. Something that might have been the beginning of shame. For what it's worth, Margot said quietly, just to Amara. You were always the smartest person in any room we put you in. We knew it. That was the problem. And then she turned and walked away too. And Amara understood that some apologies arrive 10 years late and in the wrong words, and are still, somehow, worth receiving. The table was quiet again. Amara looked at Dojin. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know. Thank you. He nodded once. Then he looked at her with the direct, considered gaze she was beginning to understand, was simply how he looked at things he took seriously. Leave with me, he said. I have a car outside, and I know a place in River Oaks that serves the closest thing to proper Korean food I have found in this city, and I think you have spent enough of your evening in this room. Amara looked around the ballroom slowly, at the people who had watched her stand alone at the drinks table 2 hours ago. At the faces that had observed her quiet humiliation with the passive satisfaction of bystanders relieved. It wasn't them. And at Trevor, who was watching from across the room with an expression she finally allowed herself to read. And what she found there was not malice and not indifference, but something smaller and sadder than either. Regret. The specific regret of a man who made a calculation a long time ago, who chose the room over the girl because the choice was easy, and who is only now watching her walk away with a man who crossed an ocean for her, receiving the full invoice for what that easy choice had cost. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked away first. He had let go of her hand once in a corridor. He had no right to hold her eyes now, and somewhere beneath the regret, he seemed to know it. She thought about the girl who had almost not come tonight, the one who'd stood in her closet 3 days ago, heard the whisper that said, "Don't go," and chosen to come anyway, because a stubborn and tender part of her still believed that things could be different, that she deserved to take up space in rooms that had once made her feel small. She thought about the woman who'd sat on cold steps in Seoul beside a stranger who needed someone, and had simply been there, simply been kind, without asking why or expecting anything at all. And she thought about the strange arithmetic of kindness, how it doesn't come back on schedule, or in the forms you anticipate, but how sometimes, on an otherwise unremarkable Wednesday, it walks back through a ballroom door in a black suit and finds you at the drinks table and reminds you, in front of everyone who ever made you feel invisible, exactly how much you were always worth. She stood up. She took his hand. Outside, the Houston night was warm and thick with the particular aliveness of a city in spring. The cars were waiting, the way they always were when Seo Do-jin was somewhere, and needed to be somewhere else. The doorman held the door. The city lights spread out gold and generous in front of them, the way city lights look only from inside a moment that finally feels like the beginning of something. He paused before the open car door and looked at her, not the sealed composure he'd worn into the room, but something open and a little uncertain. I rehearsed what I would say to you, he admitted, on the plane, For 13 hours. None of it was baby. There you are. That was not in the plan. No? I saw you across the room, he said. And the plan stopped mattering. Amara laughed again, softer this time, and did not let go of his hand. Behind them, through the tall glass doors of the hotel, Brooke Ashford stood very still, holding a champagne flute she'd forgotten she was holding, watching the car door close, watching the convoy pull smoothly into the night, watching until the taillights disappeared around the corner and the street was ordinary again. And Amara Reeves, scholarship girl, self-sufficient woman, the one they said intimidated men, the one they said needed to be less, the one who had cried quietly in a hotel bathroom less than an hour before, did not look back. She had spent 10 years looking back at rooms that never deserved that much of her attention, and she was finished with that now. She looked forward instead, into the city, into the warm, bright night, into something that for the first time in longer than she could remember felt entirely, completely, and undeniably like hers. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Tell us in the comments which moment shocked you the most. Thanks for watching Afro Soul Tales, and we'll see you in the next story.